Welcome back to another episode of Odd Hour. Do you believe in ghosts? Do you think you could ever prove their existence definitively? Many have certainly tried on infamous paranormal investigation shows that present their evidence through EVPs and footage and photography. Ghosts and spirits are a frequently tapped source for a good story, whether it be to add to a good mystery or simply speak to the fears of any listening. There are many out there who, themselves, want to tell a good story, maybe even insert themselves into the story. People like psychics, like mediums, claim to have the ability to let ghosts speak through them to various, and almost always incorrect, results. But what about channel them, become them, create them, even photograph them? One such spirit manifested herself through the body of a medium named Florence. But who was she? Was she real? A figment of imagination? Did Florence truly believe she was a conduit for an unknown spirit? Or was she simply the victim of an overzealous scientist who wanted nothing more than to confirm the occult? It may be easy to toss the story aside as simply false. But this spirit was photographed, and photographed as evidence for one of the first scientific studies into spiritualism and the occult. This is the story of Florence Cook and her spiritual friend, Katie King. Florence Cook, also known as Flory, was a young girl when her mediumistic powers began to manifest. The voices and apparitions of spirits were said to speak and visit her from as far back as her very early childhood. And true to many wild tales told by children, her powers were chalked up to being simply an overactive imagination. By age 15, however, they were treated not simply as powers, but rather a true manifestation of spiritual activity through the young Florence. Done under her mother's consent and guidance, Florence's earliest displays were tea parties. Florence was hesitant, and at first she refused this display of her abilities. She soon, however, quote, consented to the experiment. Extraordinary things were reported, including the table being unmanageable and Cook being levitated, unquote. Initially a performance for close family and friends, Florence would continue these demonstrations. Again, under the guidance of her mother, she further partook in an act of spirit writing, in which it is said that a spirit manipulates a living host to convey a written message. This message, which appeared as a reversed image, stated that Florence should research an institute known as the Dalston Association. It was a slow start, but gradually Florence entered the sphere of spiritualism and would begin giving seances by 1870. For a time, she traveled, sitting and studying with other famed medium contemporaries, the first two being Frank Hearn and Charles Williams. Under Hearn, Florence, quote, held her first sittings, and it is said that she may have learned some of the techniques of physical mediumship from the man, unquote. Soon, manifestations in the Hearn and Williams seances became too strong for Florence to handle, and her mother pulled her away from the limelight to conduct these seances in their own home. From here, her methods gradually developed. A year into her mediumship, Katie was said to have first appeared in a seance conducted in London. Multiple sources place the inaugural manifestation in London, while others place it in a Hearn and Williams seance. Nevertheless, most sources place the year around 1871. Descriptions of the spirit would vary, though many described Katie as, quote, resembling Cook, while others claimed King was taller than Cook, with a larger face and different hair and skin, unquote. These early manifestations of Katie were far less physical and intense than what she would later demonstrate. In a seance with two medium siblings named the Davenport brothers, Katie is described mostly as a voice rather than a figure. Quote, a shrill female voice was heard immediately in front of us. It was intimated that it was Kate who was speaking. Most of what was said would come under the category of small, very small, wit, unquote. King and Cook would be separate entities in the room at the same time, with Cook being indisposed of, while King fully manifested. She declared herself the daughter of John King, who while alive was a pirate who later became the governor of Jamaica, and known to the world as Henry Owen Morgan. This would make Katie's so-called human form Annie Owen Morgan. In a skeptical outline of the tale, Annie Morgan is described as, quote, a colorful character. Annie died at about age 23 after murdering her 2 children and committing various other crimes. She said she had returned to try and expiate her sins, and attached herself mainly to Florence Cook for that purpose, unquote. What is intriguing about this connection between John King and Katie King is that John was heavily associated with Frank Hearn and his seances. Perhaps this influenced Florence's manifestations. These manifestations would later increase in intensity, Katie becoming a physical force, which began to draw the skepticism from the audiences Florence would perform before. This skepticism came to a head in an infamous seance. A lawyer named William Volkman attended a seance led by Cook in December 1873. In seances such as this, Florence would gather her audience before a cabinet door. An article from the Philadelphia Inquirer, dated January 11, 1875, describes the atmosphere that Florence would create in order to manifest Katie King. Quote, Florence procured a black cloth and took it with her on all occasions when she went into the cabinet, and when requested, she would stand nearby the door, and after requesting that the room should be made quite dark, would gradually and slowly cover her body with this cloth, at the same time crouching in the corner of the cabinet, and when entirely covered, would gradually remove it again, which had the appearance of Katie's body slowly fading out and reappearing. No one could doubt for a moment that Katie had materialized and disappeared in their presence. Katie always kept in her hand during this exhibition a bouquet of flowers, which she covered and uncovered with the cloth, to give it the appearance of disappearing, unquote. This cabinet would become a crucial piece of her seances. As King manifested in this 1873 seance, she began to hold hands with her audience. Sources do not state whether or not the spirit spoke. Volkman began to notice a resemblance between Cook and King, a resemblance not first noticed by this man, but was documented by many of her audience members. Volkman, in a quick moment, then seized the spirit's hand and waist, of which he physically held on. In a wrestle, the spirit was removed from the man's grasp and forced back into the cabinet, and moments later Florence re-emerged. An article published the week following the incident recounted the moment of seizure, often called ghost grabbing in many sources. Quote, this evening at Miss Cook's seance, during the appearance of what purported to be the spirit Katie, a man named Volkman rose up, grasped her round the waist with both arms, and tried to throw her down at his feet. Mr. Tapp and Mr. Corner seized the man, who thus broke the conditions which we were all admitted on the understanding we would keep. Katie instantly extricated herself from his clutches, and aided by Mr. Luxmore, was in a moment back in the cabinet. After a delay of about 5 minutes, during which Katie gave earnest instructions to the sitters, the cabinet was opened, and Miss Cook was found in black dress and boots, with the tape tightly around her waist. As at the beginning of the seance, the knot sealed as at first with the signet ring of the Earl of Caithness, and sewn underneath the seal with thread, as it had been sewn before the seance by Mr. Luxmore, unquote. This experience sealed the idea in Volkman's mind that Florence Cook's mediumship and seance was simply a masquerade, and he published his opinion in a local journal shortly thereafter. This incident caused an upheaval among Florence and her supporters, as newspapers began to report on the opinion piece as an exposure of a fraud, as opposed to a review of services. At the same time as Florence was giving demonstrations such as these, she was the subject of a case study by renowned scientist William Crookes. Crookes, up to this point, had established himself as a pioneer in the science community. Among his notable achievements includes the discovery of the element thallium through the use of spectroscopy, a branch of science that works to measure the number of spectra, or light, emitted when interacting with electromagnetic radiation. This was done through his invention of a cathode ray tube, one of the earliest of its kind, and applying thousands of volts through the tube. He further created an early version of a radiometer, which measures radiant light, and invented a UV filter lens that was used for sunglasses. It was through this work that Crookes gained an interest in the occult, and studied on how it could relate to his scientific work. Crookes had sat before Florence in a seance, and had sat for many mediums as he began his studies into spiritualism, and it was decided on that Crookes would investigate the mediumship of Cook under his conditions. His conditions were as follows, quote, "It must be in his own home, with his own selection of friends and spectators, under his own conditions, and he may do whatever he would like as regards apparatus," unquote. These investigations began in 1871 and would not end until 1874. Crookes' investigations would ultimately result in a publication of his observations, of which there were many. Crookes describes Cook's willingness to participate in an ending chapter of his published observations on her. Quote, "Every test that I have proposed, she has at once agreed to submit to with the utmost willingness. She is open and straightforward in speech, and I have never seen anything approaching the slightest symptom of deception if she were to try. And if she did, she would certainly be found quickly, for such a line of action is altogether foreign to her nature," unquote. As the experiments continued under the watchful eye of the scientist Crookes, he and many others sought to prove the existence of Katie. In an early seance, Crookes observed that Katie, quote, "walked about, talked, allowed herself to be weighed and measured, and even held the family's baby." This obviously in and of itself does not prove the existence of spirits, but rather the willingness of a young girl eager to establish herself as a leading spiritualist, one who was taught in the ways of mediumship by men with later controversies in terms of fraudulent behavior, and further proves the ability to be deceptive in the face of those seeking to prove the supernatural. Florence would continue her cabinet-style seances in the Crookes family home. Cook would be tied up in her cabinet, Florence wearing black and Katie wearing white. Crookes described one such seance that was held in the house of a close friend. Quote, "The cabinet was a back drawing room, separated from the front room in which the company sat by a curtain. The usual formality of searching the room and examining the fastenings having been gone through, Miss Cook entered the cabinet. After a little time, the form of Katie appeared at the side of the curtain, but soon retreated, saying her medium was not well, and could not be put into a sufficiently deep sleep to make it safe for her to be seen," unquote. The main observations from these seances documents Katie King as a physical figure, one that can be touched, emits sweat, a blood and gut spirit rather than the typical wispy ghost. Often, Cook and Katie would appear within the same room, but Florence's face would be coincidentally covered or masked. Many observers noted a similarity in appearance between the two women, as Volkmann discovered for himself in 1873, and this was a fact Crookes wrote on often. Crookes was adamant that Florence was not lying or showing deception, and many of his experiments involved proving the separate existence of King. He wrote dissuading the similarities as such, quote, "Katie's height varies. In my house, I have seen her 6 inches taller than Miss Cook. Katie's neck was bare last night. The skin was perfectly smooth both to touch and sight, whilst on Miss Cook's neck was a larger blister, which under similar circumstances is distinctly visible and rough to the touch. Katie's fingers are much longer than Miss Cook's, and her face is also larger," unquote. Even further, Crookes would take the separate pulse of both King and Cook, finding that King's would fall towards 75 beats per minute, and moments later, Cook's would be resting near 90. Other witnesses to King's manifestations, such as Cook's friend Florence Marriott, display a bizarrely risque moment during her materializations. Quote, "Katie called me after her into the back room, and dropping her white garment, stood perfectly naked before me. 'Now,' Katie said, 'you can see that I am a woman,' which indeed she was, and a most beautifully made woman too, and I examined her well, whilst Miss Cook lay beside us on the floor," unquote. It was often that Cook would allow others to witness her in the cabinet or drawing room, but often one at a time, and would give directions on awakening her through Katie. Such a moment is described by Marriott, who several sentences later writes that Katie told her to wait until she tapped 3 times to light a match, upon which Florrie would awaken and would need Marriott's help. Marriott even describes an incident where she is allowed to cut Katie's hair. Quote, "She had a profusion of ringlets falling to her waist that night. I obeyed religiously, hacking the hair wherever I could, while she kept on saying, 'Cut more, cut more. Not for yourself, you know, because you can't take it away.' So I cut off curl after curl, and as fast as they fell to the ground, the hair grew again upon her head. When I had finished, Katie asked me to examine her hair to see if I could detect any place where I had used the scissors, and I did so without any effect. Neither was the severed hair to be found. It had vanished out of sight." Unquote. Of the most popular observations from Crookes are his series of photographs taken of Katie's manifestations. The images, actually taken by a man named William Harrison during Crookes' sessions, are among the first to capture the materialized figure. While nearly 55 were taken, it appears that the negatives were seemingly destroyed upon Crookes' death, so many are unfortunately lost. Of the few that survive, Katie is depicted in a white robe, often holding on to or sitting upon someone else, most likely as a way to prove human vitals, as Marriott once describes asking Katie if she had a beating heart or veins. Her response was a simple, "I have what Florrie has." She is often posed, and it is hard to tell how candid the images are. Her arms are frequently crossed over her chest, mimicking the pose of a body once laid in a coffin. While Katie is photographed with eyes closed, Florence has several of herself with her eyes open. Their appearances are, as Volkman discovered, strikingly similar. Marriott, funnily enough, acknowledges this herself, despite her belief in the manifestations. She writes, quote, "Katie was photographed many times by limelight by Mr. Alfred Crookes, but her portraits are all too much like her medium to be of any value establishing her claim to a separate entity." Unquote. A further look at the photography displays additional obfuscations from those in the occult sphere. Jenny and Nelson Holmes, American mediums who operated in New York, claimed to have both materialized and photographed Katie King. The Holmeses had no connection to Florence Cook herself, but as news of the King manifestations spread to America, it is clear that they may have tried to take advantage of the rising popularity of spiritual photography. In the Holmes' manifestation, with politician Robert Dale Owen as a witness, King appeared. An article published subsequently, however, called the whole operation into question, as a woman came forward and claimed to be the Katie King that had appeared in the Holmes' photographs. This woman, Eliza White, was said to have matched the description of Cook's Katie, and stated that she was hired by the Holmeses. While there is no major reasoning for White to be lying about her masquerading, there are sources that claim White tried to extort money from the Holmeses. Regardless, the doubts raised around the photography worked to ruin the credibility of the images. The photography revolving around Katie King all take a singular, ginormous leap in their scientific efficacy. The Holmeses, for example, quote, had not wanted to photograph the real Katie King, since bright light would have ruined the materialization, unquote. Crookes, too, employed the supposed low-light technique in his sessions. A description of one exhibition from author Trevor Hall goes as follows, quote, "The sessions were held with the medium secluded in the dark, because spiritualists believed that materialization required very dim surroundings to succeed, though occasionally the spirits materialized in the light, and some photographs were taken," unquote. Over the course of these 3 years spent with Crookes, King manifested nearly every seance. Manifestations got to the point where Florence would be lying on the floor beside Katie, who would appear and disappear through her spirit cabinet. Her final appearances, much to the sadness of her friends, occurred towards the end of May 1874. Katie called upon Crookes to sit with her in the cabinet in her final moments, and Crookes writes poetically on her leaving, quote, "Stooping over her, Katie touched her and said, 'Wake up, Florrie, wake up. I must leave you now.' Miss Cook then woke and tearfully entreated Katie to stay a little time longer. 'My dear, I can't. My work is done. God bless you,' Katie replied, and then continued speaking to Miss Cook. For several minutes, the two were conversing with each other, till at last Miss Cook's tears prevented her from speaking." Unquote. Katie would not reappear after this final manifestation, though 2 separate spiritual conduits named Layla and Marie would become King's successors. Neither were as prolific and popular as King. Despite early successes, and in spite of William Crookes' investigations, Florence's encounter with Volkman soured the public against her. In 1880, during a public séance at the British National Association of Spiritualists in London, Sir George Sitwell, one of the sitters witnessing the manifestations of Marie, seized the apparition, only to discover it to be the medium in disguise. Florence, having now been married and under the title Miss Elgie Corner, lost all credibility beyond this point. Sitwell would publish an opinion piece of the incident, giving a subtle yet conclusive rebuff to the spiritualist movement as a whole. Quote, "Now, sir, we leave general conclusions on spiritualism to others, but what we do claim to have proved is that in the first society of spiritualists in England, one of its best mediums has been detected in impersonating the spirit herself. Not wishing to further occupy your valuable space, we shall be happy to give fuller information to anyone interested in the cause of truth." Unquote. Florence would withdraw from the public after this embarrassment, and fell into poverty before her premature death from pneumonia in 1904 at age 48. The multitude of claims that King and Cook shared the same face and same body were more than enough to raise heavy doubts. Further, while Cook and King appeared within the same room, Cook would often have a shawl or a blanket covering her face. It could have been anybody posing as the young girl during these seances, an effect that would be easy to achieve in a low-lighted atmosphere that Crookes cultivated. And while Crookes definitely had motive to turn a blind eye towards these happenings, he had further motive to keep Cook close to him, both professionally and maybe, even horrifyingly, romantically. The relationship observed between Crookes and Florence is one that has come into question by historians looking into these experiments. When Crookes first met Florence, he was 39 years old, married, and had several children. Florence was a child herself, 15 years old. While there was no proven infidelity by Crookes, it comes into question whether a salacious affair occurred, as Cook was staying within the family's home during the 3 years the experiments took place. Author Trevor H. Hall, in his 1962 book entitled The Spiritualists, presents the rather unsettling theory that Crookes and Cook were having an affair in the same house that his wife and children lived, and that the photography and mediumship were a ploy to keep attentions away from toward happenings. While Hall was the first to put to paper the idea of an affair, many of those who worked with the pair or witnessed seances held suspicions. Quote, "Contemporary accounts, even those of ardent spiritualists, suggest that the relationship between Crookes and Florence had been less than impartial, as one observer referred to Crookes's gushing upon her loveliness." Unquote. What gives Trevor Hall authority to make such a claim? As found in an article titled William Crookes and the Spectral Visitor, published through the Museum of Radiation and Radioactivity, quote, "Hall had access to previously unavailable papers. This evidence included independent accounts from 2 gentlemen that Florence later had sexual relationships with, who claimed that Florence had confessed that she and Crookes had carried on an affair and that his investigations had merely been a cover." Unquote. A further account of the affair is as follows. Quote, "The most damaging allegations were made long after the death of Florence Cook. Francis G. H. Anderson made a statement to E. J. Dingwall that he had had an affair with Cook many years ago, and that one night she told him that her mediumship was fraudulent." Unquote. This is not a primary source, and came out over 50 years after the investigations, and so it would be best to take it with a grain of salt. It does, however, lend credence to other observations. It is impossible to know for sure whether they truly carried on an affair under the guise of seance, as there are other sources that describe Crookes as simply a man who had been duped by a child. Author Gordon Stein lastly suspected that, quote, "Crookes was too ashamed to admit that he had been duped by the medium Florence Cook, or that he conspired with her for sexual favors." Unquote. This does, however, place the blame of an affair mostly onto a child, who could not have legally consented to any kind of adult relationship during these investigations. Crookes, an authority figure, an academic, a man of science, taking advantage of a child to spoof spiritual photography is a highly uncomfortable answer to an enduring mystery. One final interesting theory brought up by an anthropologist named Edward Clodd charges Crookes as being heavily short-sighted. This is corroborated by biographer William Hodson Broke, who wrote that Crookes was, quote, "evidently short-sighted, but did not wear spectacles until the 1890s. Until then, he may have used a monocle or pocket magnifying glass when necessary. What limitations this imposed upon his psychic investigations, we can only imagine." Unquote. This means that until he was well into his 50s or 60s, he did not have any additional eye support. This would be 20 years after the Cook investigations. Not only is this particularly damning, especially as his physical observations were key to his investigations, it wouldn't be too much of a leap to assume that his eyesight could have continuously deteriorated the longer he worked without eyeglasses. The final nail in the coffin was that many of those within the spiritualist movement were exposed as frauds in the years following the Crookes investigations. Among the most damning were Hearn and Williams, the mentors of Cook. For many years, there were doubts about their spiritualist activities, with these being confirmed when, quote, Williams, who worked closely with Hearn, was caught cheating in seances in Paris in 1874 and in Amsterdam in 1879, unquote. Mary Showers, who worked occasionally with Cook in her seances, had a, quote, fraudulent materialization attempt. While it was never proven that Crookes had committed fraud, it can be called into question when many of those around him did. In the midst of many prominent mediums being exposed as fraudulent, the spiritualist movement gradually fell apart towards the end of the 1880s. While it has not disappeared entirely, still being practiced throughout North America and parts of Europe, spiritualism as a whole has faded like an old photograph. When once asked, "Do you think one in the flesh can ever appreciate the powers you use in manifesting?" Katie King responds, "No, you never can." Perhaps Florence was all too correct in that statement. Thank you for joining me yet again for this episode of Odd Hour. All references will be included in the description, including a transcript to read along with. Check out the spirit photography of Katie King, or in general, especially ones that purport to show ectoplasm and all kinds of gnarly spirit things. While almost definitely fraudulent, the vintage aesthetic of the images is something to behold, and they are really cool to look at. Intro music for this episode is Phantom by Density and Time, and narration music is Deep Space by Audionautics. Follow me at Odd Hour Podcast on Instagram, or email me at oddhourpodcast@gmail.com to give episode suggestions, or to ask any questions. Maybe even leave a rating and review on wherever you listen. It always helps. I'm Isaiah. Join me again soon for more mysteries, weird stories, and all things little known.